The nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like stale coffee and the particular kind of fluorescent desperation that came with the graveyard shift. Hannah Clarke moved through the ward like someone who had learned to occupy space without being noticed, a skill honed not in a classroom, but in compounds where sound could get you killed. Her badge read Hannah Clarke, RN, with a Norfolk address that wasn't quite hers and a maiden name that belonged to a woman she used to be. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining was the only true thing she still carried, faded now, the threads nearly worn through from 47 years of her finger tracing it when the scream started again at 3 in the morning. She was 2 weeks into Oak Creek Memorial. Nobody knew her before that. Nobody needed to. The night shift had a reputation for chewing through nurses like ammunition, understaffed, underfunded, the kind of graveyard run where you'd find yourself holding someone's hand while their heart stopped and there was nobody else in the building qualified to help. Hannah took it without hesitation. The anonymity was exactly what she needed. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had started fours in the dust storms of Helmand Province with nothing but a field pack and a prayer. The 20-gauge angiocath needle slid into a patient's vein in the surgical recovery unit with the kind of casual precision that made the day shift nurses watch her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She didn't make mistakes. She didn't drop things. She didn't fumble. The medications were drawn in the right amounts, the charting was meticulous, the patient stabilized under her hands like they had no other choice. But her hand shook when she held coffee. The head nurse, a woman named Reeves who'd been running recovery for 17 years, had noticed that. Noticed that Hannah never used the staff cafeteria, never sat in the break room, never ate anywhere but the roof access stairs at 2:06 a.m. when the hospital was as close to silent as a building full of dying people could get. Reeves noticed a lot of things, that Hannah's shoulders stayed level even when things went wrong, that her eyes moved like she was checking angles and distances, that the patients got quieter when Hannah was working, not out of fear but something like recognition. "She'll be gone by Friday," Dr. Sterling announced in the nurses' station on Hannah's 9th shift, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man whose career had been built on certainty and the kind of institutional backing that made certainty feel earned. He was the chief of surgery at Oak Creek, which meant he had the board's ear and the hospital's trust and a wife on the Hospital Foundation's executive committee. He meant something here. Too soft for real medicine. You can see it. The way she moves around the patients like she's afraid of them. The other nurses didn't respond. They knew better than to disagree with Sterling. Hannah was 2 floors above the nurse's station at that moment, in the step-down unit, adjusting the ventilator settings on a patient whose post-operative pain wasn't responding to the standard protocols. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't thinking about him at all. Her mind was in Marjah, in the compound where they'd run the field hospital with nothing but what they could carry, no ventilators, no monitors, no antibiotics from a pharmacy. Just hands and training and the weight of knowing that 3 miles away there were people trying to kill the men she was trying to save. That was real medicine. The kind where you didn't have a choice about whether to keep trying. Room 314 was on Hannah's rounds at 4:15 a.m. The admit had come in at midnight, a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne named Staff Sergeant Marcus Morrison, training accident during a night jump, collapsed left lung from the impact. The morning X-ray showed a training injury, not a combat wound, but his name on the chart had made something in Hannah's chest tighten with a recognition she'd spent for years trying to forget. Morrison was sleeping when she entered, his right arm draped across the bed rail and his left forearm visible above the hospital gown. There. A tattoo in military standard black ink on the inside of his wrist. 6 letters, Reaper. Below it, a number. 6. Hannah's hand stopped moving. She stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds before the professional part of her brain kicked back in, the part that wasn't drowning in a dust storm 12 years ago, the part that could see a patient instead of a ghost. She moved to the bedside. Checked the 4 line. Adjusted the oxygen, running at 2 liters, his O2 sat 94%, good. The monitors showed a steady rhythm, 78 beats per minute, the composure of a man who'd learned to sleep through worse things than a collapsed lung. She made a notation in the chart, resting comfortably. O2 sat adequate. Pain control adequate. Lung re-expansion proceeding normally. Morrison stirred. His eyes opened, green eyes, the kind that had looked directly at her across the compound in Marjah when she'd given orders, and he'd nodded once and executed them with the kind of precision that only came from understanding exactly how badly things could go wrong. The eyes closed again. He didn't recognize her. His brain registered a nurse, someone in scrubs, someone doing her job. Not the operator. Not the woman whose call sign had once meant something to the men in his unit, the woman who'd carried him 3 miles under fire with 2 bullets in her armor plate and her hand steady enough to work on his chest when they got to the landing zone. That woman had worn combat boots and a call sign and the kind of absolute authority that came from keeping people alive when the world was actively trying to kill them. This Hannah Clarke was someone else entirely. She finished her assessment and left without speaking. The hallway outside his room was empty, all the other patients stable, all the monitors running their electronic songs into the false darkness of 4:23 a.m. Hannah stood for a moment against the wall and let her hand move inside her jacket, through the interior lining, until her fingers found the patch. The stitching was rough now. She'd done it herself 12 years ago, after she left. The choice to disappear had been the only choice that made sense. She'd gotten out after 23 years, a senior chief petty officer with decorations that meant something to people who understood what she'd actually done, and decorations that meant nothing to her except a weight that never got lighter. The PTSD had become unbearable somewhere between her 3rd and 4th tour. The ghosts had started showing up at the grocery store. She'd seen Marjah in a parking lot at the base. She'd found herself checking angles on her own house like it was a combat zone. Her late husband, Thomas, had held her through the worst of it, but he was gone now 3 years, and there was nothing left to hold her to that life except the grief. So she'd become Hannah Clarke again, instead of Hannah Morrison. She'd taken the nursing certification she'd kept dormant and found the graveyard shift at a hospital where nobody asked questions about a middle-aged woman who knew how to work without drawing attention. Nobody needed to know about the 23 years. Nobody needed to know about the operators she'd trained or the lives she'd carried out of collapsed compounds or the reason she still woke up at 3:56 a.m. certain that someone was bleeding out and there was nothing in her hands to stop it. The shift dragged into the false dawn of 6:53 a.m. Hannah was back on rounds, checking the post-op patients, monitoring the recovery unit. In room 314, Morrison was awake and alert, eating the soft diet that post-operative protocol allowed. He looked better than his chart suggested he should. The human body was surprising that way, resilient in the face of training accidents, less resilient in the face of actual warfare. But she wasn't thinking about that. She was keeping her mind in the present tense, where she was just a nurse and he was just a patient and neither of them carried anything heavier than their own medical charts. That's when she heard the shoes. Dr. Sterling's expensive dress shoes clicked against the tile floor at 6:48 a.m. like a clock counting down to something. Hannah heard him before she saw him, heard the confidence in every step, the specific rhythm of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space. He was doing morning rounds, which meant he was performing, checking patients, reviewing charts, confirming his authority in the surgical recovery unit. The other nurses deferred to him. They should. He was the surgeon. He had the credentials and the background and the position that mattered in this particular ecosystem. Hannah was charting the last of the night shift notes at the nurse's station when Sterling arrived. She didn't look up. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual dying insect song overhead. The monitor stations beeped in their syncopated rhythm. And then Sterling's voice cut through it all, loud and designed to be heard. "So you're the mystery nurse everyone's been raving about," he said. Not to her specifically. Just loud enough that she would know he was speaking about her. The one who's too good to use the cafeteria. Too delicate for hospital politics. Hannah didn't respond. She kept charting. The pen moved steadily across the paper, vital signs, medication times, patient responses. All true. All documented. All the kind of work that didn't require acknowledgement. "I've been thinking," Sterling continued, moving closer now, his presence occupying the space the way certain people learn to do, by assuming they had the right to it. You're not going to last. That kind of dainty composure doesn't work in a real medical environment. I'll give you until Friday. Then you'll remember you're too soft for this. He said it loud enough that the other nurses could hear him. That was the point. The bet. The public declaration that Hannah Clarke didn't belong in Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Recovery Unit. The room didn't go silent. Hospital rooms never went completely silent. There were always the machines, the hum and beep and whoosh of life support systems keeping people alive despite their bodies' best efforts to fail. But something shifted in the air. The other nurses were suddenly very focused on their own charts, their own patients, anything that would keep them from being part of what was happening. Hannah set her pen down. Finished the last notation. And then she looked up at Sterling for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to see her eyes, which were the color of the Atlantic in winter, and which held nothing in them that he could read. No anger. No fear. No hurt feelings about being publicly dismissed. Just the flat professional regard of someone who had seen worse things than a man in expensive shoes. Is there something else you need, doctor? She asked. Her voice was low, not soft, but controlled. The kind of control that came from knowing exactly how much damage you could do if you decided to do it, and having decided long ago not to. Sterling smiled. The confidence didn't waver. Why would it? He had never met a version of himself that the hospital structure wouldn't protect. Just stating facts, he said. And then he walked to room 314 to check on Morrison, his shoes clicking in that particular rhythm of certainty. Hannah returned to her charting. Her hand was steady. The notes were meticulous. Nobody in that nurse's station knew that she had spent for years trying to forget how to give orders, and that she had just demonstrated, without saying a single word, that the forgetting was not quite complete. The cafeteria smelled like industrial beef and burnt coffee when Sterling's elbow caught her lunch tray. Hannah was reaching for her chair at 12:27 p.m., a Tuesday, her hands steady as they always were. The tray tilted. Food scattered, mashed potatoes sliding across linoleum, green beans rolling like tiny spheres of shame, the sandwich she'd made at midnight landing face down in the spreading mess. 3 residents watched from 2 tables away, their eyes suddenly very interested in their own plates. Sterling didn't stop walking. Clumsy, he said over his shoulder, and one of the residents laughed, that nervous, uncertain sound of someone testing whether cruelty was permitted. It was. Sterling had established the permission structure with a single word, delivered with the casual precision of a man whose family name was on a building wing at Duke University. Hannah knelt to clean it up. The fluorescent lights above her cast everything in that sickly institutional white that made everyone look equally dead inside. She gathered the paper towels from the dispenser, her hands moving with the same mechanical efficiency she'd used in Marjah when picking up pieces that used to be Marines. The difference was that in Marjah, the pieces mattered. Here, Sterling was just testing whether she would break. She didn't eat for the rest of her shift. Her stomach made noise at 3 a.m., but she ignored it the way she'd ignored worse things. 2 days later came the morning rounds. Sterling threw the patient chart at her feet in front of the entire surgical team. The folder hit the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot in an empty corridor, sharp, sudden, impossible to unhear. 8 people were present. 8 people watched it happen. 8 people would remember exactly how it looked when a senior chief petty officer from Special Forces knelt to pick up a chart that had been thrown at her by a man whose only qualification for cruelty was that he'd never been tested by anything that mattered. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for the people he'd decided were beneath him. "And next time, try reading the orders correctly, though I know that's challenging for someone with your limitations." The surgical team froze. One of the younger residents, a woman named Dr. Chen whose hand shook slightly when she sutured, looked like she wanted to say something. She didn't. Nobody did. Sterling had established the permission structure so thoroughly that even witnessing his cruelty was beginning to feel like complicity. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take when rounds of incoming fire turned a field hospital into organized chaos. The kind of breath that meant her nervous system was about to be locked down tighter than a submarine door. A single tear escaped. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it fall down her cheek while keeping her eyes fixed directly on Sterling's face, and then, without breaking eye contact, she wiped it away with the back of her hand. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the devastating part. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision about who she was, and she was not going to apologize for it. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent ICU wheeze its mechanical rhythm through the hallway. Sterling's face flushed crimson, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had turned a valve inside his chest. His jaw clenched. His hands formed fists at his sides, and for a moment, Hannah thought he might actually strike her. The fantasy lasted exactly 2.3 seconds before his survival instinct kicked in. He couldn't hit her. Not in front of witnesses. Not in front of Dr. Chen, who would absolutely report it. "You're insubordinate," Sterling said, but his voice had changed. It had developed a tremor. "We'll discuss this with administration." Hannah picked up the chart. She scanned the orders, 3 of which were actually incorrect, she noted with the grim satisfaction of someone who had studied medication protocols in 7 different field hospitals, and continued with her rounds as if Sterling had never spoken. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver when she reported vitals to the team. But something had shifted in the space between them, and everyone in that surgical suite felt it. That afternoon, one of the residents, a man named Dr. Morrison, no relation to the paratrooper in room 314, overheard Sterling on the phone in his office. The door wasn't fully closed. The words came through clearly, "I need you to look into someone for me." Then, "Hannah Clarke. Maiden name, I assume. She's working here at Oak Creek Memorial on the night shift." Then, "I don't care how you do it. I want her hiring paperwork reviewed. All of it. Everything." Sterling was making his first strategic move, and he was doing it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before. He had allies in the hospital administration. He had connections. He had the kind of institutional power that came from being a chief of surgery whose family had donated $4.2 million to the hospital's surgical wing over the past 15 years. What he didn't have was any idea who he was standing next to. By 6 p.m., the story of what Hannah had said to Sterling was circulating through the hospital like a virus. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, Doctor." The night shift nurses were repeating it. The daytime custodial staff was repeating it. Even the respiratory therapists had heard about it by the time they clocked in at 7 a.m. the next morning. What they didn't know was that Hannah had spent for years trying to convince herself that she was capable of being invisible. What they didn't understand was that the tremor that had run through her body when she picked up that chart wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was the feeling of muscle memory waking up after a long hibernation. It was the part of her that had led 47 Marines through the Sanjin Valley in the dark, the part that had called in fire support for wounded soldiers, the part that understood that when someone tested you, you had to establish a response that made it clear testing you again would be a mistake. She was supposed to be a civilian now. She was supposed to fade into the background and heal quietly and never raise her voice. She was supposed to accept that Dr. Sterling was the predator and she was the prey, and that was the natural order of hierarchies in American hospitals. But standing in the medication dispensary at 8:02 p.m., restocking saline bags with mechanical efficiency, Hannah understood that she had just made a dangerous enemy. Sterling wasn't the type of man to let an insult stand. He was the type to escalate. To gather allies. To use every tool in his institutional arsenal to ensure that the person who had humiliated him would pay for it. She had 12 days before the first investigator would arrive. 12 days before Sterling's call to administration would trigger a review of her hiring documents. 12 days before everything she had built here would begin to crumble. She didn't know this yet. But her body knew it. Her instincts knew it. The part of her that had survived Marjah understood with absolute certainty that war had come to Oak Creek Memorial, and she had just fired the first shot. What she didn't know was that her choice to speak, to let her voice rise just enough to be heard, to meet Sterling's contempt with the cold weight of her composure, had set something else in motion. Something bigger. Something that was already moving toward her in the form of a military convoy, 48 hours in the future, with orders that would change everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was about to arrive in an ambulance, coding, with a tattoo on his forearm that read Reaper 6. The ER doors burst open at 2:47 a.m., and the world compressed into 43 seconds of controlled chaos. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man whose body had already begun its shutdown sequence, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, blood pressure collapsing into nothing, his chest cavity filling with air that had no right being there. The patient's dog tags caught the fluorescent light as the paramedics transferred him onto the ER bed, and Hannah saw the name stamped in military block letters before her brain could process what her eyes were reading: Morrison. SSGT Morrison. The same Morrison from room 314. The same Morrison who'd been breathing fine 20 minutes ago, stable with a healing chest tube, his collapsed lung re-inflating day by day. Now his blood oxygen was 58% and his heart rate was climbing into the 160s, his body screaming the silent scream of someone suffocating from the inside. The monitor's rhythm stuttered like it was trying to decide between survival and surrender. Dr. Sterling appeared at the bedside within seconds, his surgical ego preceding him into the trauma bay like a wave of expensive cologne and starched superiority. He looked down at the coding paratrooper with the same expression he'd worn when he knocked Hannah's lunch tray from her hands, detached, dismissive, certain of his own primacy. He reached for the chart, not the equipment. He was reading the admission notes instead of examining the patient's chest. Tension pneumothorax, Hannah said quietly, already moving toward the decompression kit. Already calculating. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Needle at a 90-degree angle to break through skin and parietal pleura. The hiss of air that would follow, that blessed, terrible hiss of pressure releasing. She'd done this in the dark outside Marjah with nothing but her hands and muscle memory and the sound of Morrison's wheezing breath beneath her palms. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the ER noise like a surgical saw on bone. "Someone call pulmonology," he said, his tone tight as a tourniquet. "We need a consult before we—" But there was no time for consults. There was no time for committee approval or institutional procedure or the careful ballet of hierarchy that defined civilian medicine. Morrison's oxygen saturation had dropped to 49%. His lips were turning the color of slate. His pupils were dilating like he was already disappearing into that final dark. Hannah's hand closed on the decompression needle, 14 gauge, bevel tip gleaming under the trauma bay lights. The touch of it against her palm was like a key turning in a lock she'd kept sealed for 18 months. "Nurse Clarke, step away from that equipment," Dr. Sterling barked, and his voice had taken on the texture of a man who suddenly understood he was being disobeyed. "That is not within your scope of practice. I'm ordering you to." She didn't hear the rest. Her body had already shifted into the language it had spoken in Marjah, in the dust storm outside forward operating base Shank, in the cave mouth near Sanjin Valley where her hands had learned that speed and silence and absolute certainty were the only medicines that mattered. She positioned Morrison's right arm above his head to expose the chest wall fully. Her fingers found the intercostal space with the kind of precision that could only come from having done this while artillery shook the earth beneath her feet. One hand steadied the rib. One hand guided the needle. The angle was perfect. The depth was exact. The hiss came. Air escaped from the thoracic cavity like a long, released breath, like pressure finally breaking, like the world pivoting on a single moment of mechanical salvation. The ventilator cycled. The oxygen saturation began its climb. 58%. 62%. 69%. 82%. Each number was a small resurrection. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. Hannah maintained the needle, steady as a surgical laser, and didn't turn to look at him. She'd already learned the hard way that some men couldn't handle being wrong, couldn't stomach the sight of a woman doing what they'd been trained to do but had frozen to do. Sterling's eyes had gone wide with something that looked like recognition but probably wasn't, probably wasn't the moment he should have understood that the quiet nurse with weathered hands and the faded scar tissue on her knuckles was something far more complicated than too soft for real medicine. His phone came out of his pocket instead. He raised it toward the stretcher, toward Hannah bent over Morrison, toward the needle she'd positioned while his medical degree sat useless in its frame somewhere in his office. He began to record. The phone's camera caught the angle perfectly, caught her exceeding her scope, caught her practicing medicine without a license, caught her breaking the foundational rule of civilian healthcare that had been drummed into every nurse from orientation day forward. "For the record," Dr. Sterling said loudly, his voice steady again now that he had a weapon other than medicine, "I am ordering Nurse Clarke to stand down. What happens next is against my direct orders. Witnesses, please note the timestamp and the fact that I explicitly prohibited this action." He was building a case. Every word was being recorded, time-stamped, preserved for the board inquiry and the legal team he'd already started assembling. He'd known this moment was coming. He'd engineered every variable to arrive at this exact intersection: a dying patient, Hannah's inability to refuse a life, the presence of multiple witnesses, and his own phone capturing evidence of her violation. Morrison's oxygen saturation climbed past 90%. His pupils began to contract. His heart rate dropped from 160 to 120, then 105. The monitor's rhythm found something close to normal, something that suggested the possibility of continuing to exist in a world that had almost stopped existing at all. But the cost of that continuation was being filmed and documented and weaponized by a man whose entire strategy had been to force her into this moment, to push her to a place where her conscience and her training and the impossible weight of her secret would converge into a single choice that would destroy her. Hannah didn't acknowledge Sterling's words. She didn't defend her actions or explain the calculation she'd made or justify why 90 seconds of procedural violation was preferable to the alternative, which was Morrison crashing on the monitor while a cardiologist somewhere in Norfolk took 15 minutes to answer their phone. She simply maintained the needle, maintained her focus, and listened to the monitor's steady beeping like it was the only language in the room that mattered anymore. The ER nurse, a woman named Rodriguez who'd worked third shift for 8 years and knew how to recognize grace under pressure when she saw it, had already begun charting the vital signs. She'd already begun documenting Morrison's critical arrival and his response to intervention. She'd also, without being asked, positioned herself between the stretcher and Dr. Sterling's phone, which Rodriguez had recognized was not an instrument of medical care but an instrument of something else entirely. Something that smelled like strategy and premeditation and the particular kind of cruelty that came from being afraid of a woman who'd been forged in a place where weakness was a luxury that got people killed. The radio at the nurse's station crackled with incoming ambulances, 2 more traumas inbound, both priority, both requiring immediate bed space. The chaos of the ER was about to multiply, which meant Sterling would have to make a choice: continue documenting his case against Hannah, or step back into the role he'd claimed to occupy, which was chief of surgery. He couldn't do both. The ER didn't allow for divided attention, and everyone in the room, including Sterling, understood that if he didn't help manage the incoming trauma load, his absence would be noted, questioned, and documented in ways that would eventually matter. He lowered his phone. "Get that needle out," he said to Hannah, his voice tight with something that might have been rage or might have been the terrifying recognition that he'd just recorded his own indictment. "And then get out of my trauma bay." Hannah removed the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. The needle decompression had converted a tension pneumothorax into something manageable, into something that hadn't required pulmonology or consultation or committee approval. It had required a senior chief petty officer to recognize what was happening and move. She stepped back from the stretcher, her hand steady, her expression unchanged, the face of someone who'd held the line between medicine and murder in places where there was no institutional oversight, no board approval, no luxury of waiting for someone else to decide if you were allowed to save a life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling's phone had captured everything. The worst part was that he'd had an investigator on speed dial. The worst part was that the recording would be delivered to the hospital board with a detailed narrative about scope of practice violations, about a nurse practicing medicine without proper licensure, about a clear and documented case of insubordination in a trauma setting. The worst part was that Sterling didn't understand yet that he'd just handed a naval officer something far more dangerous than a trial. He'd handed her a choice. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Hannah's fingers found it without thinking, muscle memory from a dust storm outside Marjah where the screams never stopped and the morphine ran out at hour 4. The paratrooper coding on the trauma bay table gasped like a fish pulled from water, his collapsed lung stealing oxygen that wouldn't come back on its own. Dr. Sterling stood frozen 3 feet away, his surgical mask hanging around his neck, his hands at his sides. The attending had already called for backup. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Hannah moved. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid between Morrison's ribs with the smooth precision of someone who'd done this procedure in the dark while mortars fell around her. Once. Twice. 100 times in her mind during the last 6 years. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She spoke only to the ER resident beside her, "Get me a tube." The resident handed it over without question, sensing something in her tone that transcended rank or protocol. Hannah inserted the catheter. The hiss came, that unmistakable, life-saving hiss of air escaping from the space between Morrison's lung and his chest wall. Pressure releasing. Physics returning to order. The color began returning to his face before anyone could process what they'd just witnessed. The monitor climbed. 82%. 87. 92. 94. Morrison's gasping stopped. His back arched less violently. The ER team stood motionless, watching a nurse move through a procedure that should have required 3 doctors and a surgical suite, completed in 40 seconds with a needle and a plastic tube. The respiratory therapist connected the oxygen line. Morrison's saturation held steady at 96. His blood pressure stabilized at 108/70. His heart rate dropped from 148 to 102. Viable. Survivable. Saved. Hannah stepped back from the trauma bay. Her hands began to tremble now that the crisis had passed, adrenaline finally burning through her system. For just a moment, Morrison's eyes flickered open. His pupils dilated. His gaze focused on her face with sudden, confused recognition, the same look soldiers get when they see someone they thought they'd buried years ago. His lips moved. Nothing came out. But his eyes held hers, and in that moment, she could see the question forming, "How are you here? How are you alive?" Dr. Sterling closed the space with 3 quick steps, his voice switching into concerned authority like a light flicking on. "Someone get Nurse Clarke out of my ER." Not a question. A command delivered to no one in particular, addressed to everyone. He was already moving toward the hallway, already reaching for his phone, his face arranged into an expression of professional concern. Hannah heard him before the trauma bay doors even closed behind her, patient safety violation. Immediate action required. I want an incident report filed with the board president within the hour. His voice moved from the hallway into the administrative corridor, fading but never stopping. She exceeded her scope. Practiced medicine without a license. Insubordination in front of the entire ER staff. Within 40 minutes, 2 security guards appeared at the nurse's station where Hannah was documenting Morrison's transfer to the ICU. Their badges caught the fluorescent light. Their expressions were carefully neutral, men doing a job they didn't want to do. "Nurse Clarke, we need you to come with us." She followed them without resistance. They escorted her to her locker in the break room, watched while she removed her personal items, a photograph of her late husband, a half-empty container of ibuprofen, the unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden from the world. Her badge was deactivated with a keystroke. Her access codes were revoked. By noon, she was standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box containing 6 years of trying to be invisible. The head nurse had tried to protest, her voice trembling as she confronted Sterling in his office. She saved his life. That man would be dead without her. Sterling's response came back through hospital gossip within the hour. She violated protocol. Exceeded scope. The board has already initiated a formal investigation. He'd leveraged his donor connections, calls made to the hospital board president, conversations with physicians who owed him favors, activation of a network built on golf games and charity galas. The suspension came down by mid-afternoon. Pending investigation. Effective immediately. No pay. No benefits. No reinstatement timeline. That night, rain hammered against the windshield of Hannah's Honda like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. She drove to Meadowbrook Cemetery, to the plot where James Clarke had been buried 6 years ago, back when she still believed that leaving the military meant leaving the ghosts behind. The headstone was dark granite, expensive, the kind of permanence that felt like a lie. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, rain mixing with tears, her breath fogging the surface. Her voice came out as something less than a whisper, something barely audible even to herself. "I failed again," she said to the grave, to the rain, to the thunder rolling across the Norfolk sky like distant artillery. "I can't even do this right. I can't save anyone anymore. I thought I could be normal, James. I thought I could just be a nurse and nobody would know, nobody would ask, and I could disappear into this uniform and become someone else." Thunder rumbled overhead, close enough to rattle her teeth. She pressed harder against the headstone. "But I'm broken, and everything I touch turns to ash. Morrison lived because I couldn't stay invisible. And now I'm gone again, and nothing changes. Nothing ever changes." She stood in the rain for an hour. Or maybe it was 30 minutes. Time moved differently when you were standing at a grave. A car pulled into the cemetery access road, its headlights sweeping across her face. The driver, an older man in a maintenance uniform, didn't stop. He'd seen too many people standing in cemeteries in the rain to be surprised anymore. Hannah drove back to her apartment at 9:30, showered in water as hot as her skin could tolerate, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain continue its assault on the building. She didn't know that 48 hours from this moment, everything would change. She didn't know that the gates of her former life were about to burst open. She didn't know that the uniform she'd tried so hard to shed would find her again, in dress whites that she hadn't worn in 6 years, in a convoy of black SUVs that would arrive at Oak Creek Memorial with the precision of an operation planned by people who planned operations for a living. She only knew that she'd failed. Again. And that failure tasted like copper and rain and the cold stone of a grave that would never hold her because she'd already died a long time ago, on a dust road outside Marjah, carrying a man named Morrison through a hellscape where the laws of medicine didn't apply and the only rule was that you moved until you couldn't move anymore. Exactly 48 hours after Hannah Clarke saved Staff Sergeant Morrison's life, the parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial filled with the sound of diesel engines and organized precision. 3 black SUVs swept through the main entrance in tactical formation, doors slamming in perfect synchronization, the kind of arrival that made civilian staff instinctively step back. Boots hit the asphalt, polished leather on concrete, a sound like a countdown timer. 2 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms moved through the hospital's administrative wing with the efficiency of operators who'd breached far worse than a civilian building, their presence carrying that particular gravity that made people's voices drop to whispers. The taller SEAL approached the front desk, his jaw lined like a blade, and spoke with a kind of quiet authority that didn't require volume. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Call sign Reaper 6. We need her location. Not a request. It was a command wrapped in 7 words. The receptionist's hands trembled as she reached for the phone. Within minutes, word had spread through Oak Creek Memorial like electricity through a circuit. A military convoy. SEALs in dress uniforms. A name called out in the lobby that nobody here was supposed to know. Hannah Clarke had been fired 2 days ago. Hannah Clarke had been escorted out by security. Hannah Clarke was supposed to be gone. But Hannah Clarke wasn't in the hospital. She was sitting in her small apartment with the curtains drawn, her dress white spread across her bed like a ghost she'd tried to bury. The whites had cost her $847 when she'd commissioned them 13 years ago, before everything ended, and she hadn't touched them since. Her phone rang. The number was blocked. She didn't answer. It rang again. Same blocked number. The 3rd time, she picked up. Mom. Her daughter's voice cracked with something between excitement and panic. "Captain Sarah Clarke, United States Marine Corps, stationed at Camp Lejeune. There are military personnel at Oak Creek Memorial asking for you. They have your rank, your call sign, Mom. How is that possible? Your records are sealed." Hannah's hand went to her chest, feeling the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the same patch she'd worn in Marjah, in that dust storm outside Sanjin Valley when she'd carried Morrison 3 miles under fire and told him the only words that mattered: "We survive." "I'm coming to the hospital," Hannah said quietly. 15 minutes. When Hannah walked through the oak doors of Oak Creek Memorial, doors she'd been escorted away from 48 hours prior, the lobby went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric song. The 2 Navy SEALs turned in unison, and their posture changed. Recognition flickered across both faces, the kind of recognition that came from knowing someone's hands had held your brothers together when everything was falling apart. Sarah Clarke was standing beside the front desk, still in her dress blues, her eyes red-rimmed and shining. When she saw her mother, she straightened to attention, and her voice came out trembling but clear, meant for the entire lobby to hear. "My mother holds the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer." 17 years since Sarah had heard those words spoken aloud. 17 years since her mother had walked away from that world and tried to disappear into the nursing staff of a civilian hospital. She earned every rank she holds. The head nurse, Patricia Moore, who'd worked at Oak Creek for 23 years, stood holding a manila folder with her hands shaking so badly the pages rustled. She'd read Hannah's declassified file 3 minutes ago, and the reading had reordered every interaction she'd ever had with a quiet night nurse who'd worked her shifts without complaint, who'd eaten lunch alone, who'd never talked about her past. The file contained photographs of Hannah in combat fatigues, Hannah receiving medals from a 4-star general, Hannah kneeling beside a patient in a dust storm that looked like the world was ending. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, his dress white spotless, his presence carrying the weight of command. When he spoke, every word landed with precision. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke holds the Navy Cross." He paused. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. 2 silver stars. Another pause. The board president's face had gone pale. The Distinguished Service Medal. The team leader's eyes met Hannah's directly. "The President of the United States requests your presence at the White House to honor your service record and specifically to recognize your actions at Marjah, where you saved Staff Sergeant Morrison's life in an active combat zone. You are to be commended for extraordinary heroism, and for your continued service in civilian medicine, which saved his life a second time." In his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Sterling heard the commotion through his closed door. He pulled up the hospital's internal messaging system and saw the first notification: "Military ceremony in progress." His chest tightened. He closed his email, opened the security system with shaking fingers, and began searching for footage. The cafeteria knock. That beautiful moment when her lunch tray had clattered to the floor and she'd simply picked it up without meeting his eyes. The chart throw. The morning rounds where he'd watched her face for any crack and found none. His recording from the trauma bay, the one that would prove she'd operated outside her scope, that she'd exceeded her authority, that he'd been documenting her violations the entire time. He moved the mouse cursor toward the delete button. Years of dismissal of her talent, years of watching her absorb his contempt without flinching, would be erased. The evidence would evaporate. He clicked. And nothing happened. The file was locked. A message appeared on his screen: "File access restricted by system administrator. This action has been reported." Marcus Webb, the hospital IT administrator and former Army combat medic who'd served 2 tours in Helmand Province, had recognized Hannah on her first day of work. It was the way she moved, economy of motion, awareness of exits, the kind of bearing you only got from training that assumed every room might try to kill you. Webb had been quietly archiving every security file, every email Sterling had sent about her, every complaint filed, every moment of documented cruelty. While Sterling was frantically trying to delete his evidence, Webb was already on the phone with the state medical board, his voice steady and methodical as he recounted what the files would show them. Then the hospital ethics committee. Then 3 major news outlets, local first, then state, then national. Navy Cross recipient fired after saving life, the headlines would read by evening. Navy nurse dismissed while in active service to country, another. Sterling's abuse of decorated veteran exposed. By the time Dr. Sterling heard the knock on his office door, the board president and 2 security guards standing outside with expressions carved from stone, his wife had already called him 7 times. Reporters were on their lawn. His medical school roommate had sent a text, "What the hell were you thinking?" His own attorney had told him to expect a lawsuit from the Navy and the hospital foundation. His hospital privileges were suspended. His administrative access revoked. His career, the thing he'd spent 32 years building, was collapsing with the same speed that a house of cards falls when you remove the bottom card. 6 months later, Hannah Clarke stood in the East Room of the White House in her senior chief dress uniform, the medals hanging correctly on her chest, her bearing carrying the weight of the choices that had brought her here. Staff Sergeant Morrison stood beside her in his dress blues, and when he looked at her, he finally saw it, the operator he'd followed into hell, the woman whose hands had held him together when the world was trying to tear him apart. The president shook her hand. Photographers captured the moment. News outlets ran the footage on every channel. Afterward, when a reporter asked Hannah about Dr. Sterling, she paused for a long moment, the kind of pause that suggested she was reaching for something specific to say, something that mattered. "I hope he finds peace," she said quietly. "We all have battles to fight." The reporter would later note that Dr. Sterling was currently employed as a sales associate at Metropolitan Life, selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table in a strip mall outside Norfolk, his medical license under permanent review by the state board, his name now synonymous with the phrase career-ending misconduct. Hannah had been offered positions at 3 VA hospitals and at Walter Reed itself. But she'd made a different choice. She'd asked to return to Oak Creek Memorial, where the board had fired the previous administration and where they were desperate to build something new. She'd become the Director of Military Integration Services, a position that hadn't existed before, a role built around her specific expertise, helping healthcare systems understand that they might be employing decorated veterans in positions far below their capability. On her first day back, walking through the ER in civilian clothes, Hannah stopped at the trauma bay where Morrison had coded, where she'd made the choice to stop hiding. She touched the stainless steel edge of the trauma gurney, cold and smooth beneath her fingertips. The head nurse approached nervously, still getting used to addressing Hannah by her actual rank. "Senior Chief, we're honored to have you back." Hannah turned and smiled, and her voice was warm and certain, "Just Hannah is fine. Let's get to work." As she reviewed patient charts that evening, as the hospital settled into its rhythms around her, Hannah felt something shift in her chest. She reached inside her jacket lining to where the unit patch had lived all this time, and unpinned it. She held the faded fabric in her hands for a long moment, remembering the dust of Marjah, the weight of Morrison in her arms, the year she'd lost her husband to the same kind of silence that had nearly claimed her. Then she stood, walked to her new office, and pinned the patch properly to her uniform's shoulder, where it belonged, where it had belonged all along. And in that moment, standing alone in the quiet of her office, she felt her husband's hand on her shoulder, heard his voice across the distance that death couldn't erase, "Welcome home, Reaper 6. If you're a healthcare worker with a military background, or if you know someone who left their service behind to disappear into civilian life, this video is for you. Your training, your experience, your capability matters. You don't have to hide anymore. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We feature stories like Hannah's every week, stories of people reclaiming who they really are. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if the truth about who you are suddenly came to light? Would you fight to go back, or would you keep running?